Obviously, casing is going to be an issue into the future, whether it's being led by environmental issues or whether it's by consumer sentiment. So perhaps I could start off by asking Eoghan, what are the factors driving the move away from the use of peat for casing?
So I think this scenario in Europe is really dynamic, and different countries have different regulations, more so on the extraction of peat, so licensing for sphagnum bogs in Europe. Different countries have different approaches, but generally speaking, the EU context is we have about 13% of the global bogs in the world. Most of those have been degraded, so there's a regulatory push now to cease the extraction of peat, or at least make it difficult to extract peat for environmental reasons. There's also now the UK have been at the forefront, I suppose, of leading the way in terms of banning not only the extraction but the use of peat. And so they have the most aggressive timelines for the use of peat. And I think very much the rest of Europe is looking on to see how that plays out.
Okay, thank you. Jackie, you're the big peat supplier in New Zealand. Do you see any issues here from a regulatory viewpoint which may preclude your extraction of peat down in Invercargill in the future?
For our current extraction, I think we've...
Can't hear you. I can't hear you. Not yet.
Sorry.
Well, for our existing resources, we've got resource consents in place for the foreseeable future for those. In terms of any new extractions, I think the way that the New Zealand regulations work is that activities are controlled. So there are some degraded resources that may be available in the future. There will just be restrictions around those with the rehabilitation of those after extraction. So I think if you look at rehabilitation after extraction being rehabilitation to a functioning wetland, you take an area that is organic soil but not a functioning wetland, there's potential to extract from that. And when you're finished extracting, turning that back into a functioning wetland and improving on that, rather than taking a wetland, extracting, backfilling, and then turning to pasture, which was appropriate 30 years ago, but maybe not appropriate anymore.
Okay, thank you. So, can I ask our Dutch friends, do we need to be concerned about peat into the future?
Me first?
What you want?
In the future is for casing soil not a concern, I think. It is more a concern for food security in the world. But we look now to casing soil, but we have to look more to the food security in the world and alternatives. We need all the alternatives for substrates. The world population is growing in the world, and we need more food. And there are not enough raw materials available, so we need in the future more peat instead of less peat to secure the food security in the world. And that's a thing what many people forget. We need 300% approximately more substrates in the future, because what I told, the world population is growing. And where is the peat going to in the future? Not to the UK. Africa is a big growing market for substrates, also China. They don't look to sustainability at the moment, and that's a thing what we don't have to forget.
Thank you. Ronald?
Yeah, well, basically, I can agree a little bit, of course, but yeah, we should be concerned a little bit. The problem at the moment for us as a casing supplier is that our resources in Germany, they are going to stop in the future. That we cannot ignore. So that means actually that we have to move our facility to the Baltic states, or we have to more transport from the Baltic states to our facility and add a lot of costs. So actually that's where our challenge is. So I'm not concerned that there's not enough peat. It's more than enough peat to use. Regulations in the Baltic states I cannot control. We know what's happening in Germany, so that means we have to move our facility to make sure that we can still supply for the future. But basically more than enough resources.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And we already use 20% in our blend Swedish peat, and it will only increase because of the German peat is not enough in the future. And we're going to increase the volume of that peat for Australia and New Zealand, for example.
So if I could ask Jody, what's the situation in terms of Canada and your operation and suppliers there?
Yep. So in Canada, long time ago in the 1990s, generation before myself, they had the foresight to band together as an association and to really put a lot of time, effort, and money into funding research on peatland restoration. But not only that, kicking off the ball now on CO2 emissions research and sequestration research. So we've done a good job of this, and I could speak to Canada's situation being a little bit different than the Baltics and Europe, where we've got 25% of the worldwide peat. The footprint up to now, the industry, from the start of the industry until now, we're only using about 35. We've only touched 35,000 hectares. So that represents 0.03% of all the peatlands in Canada. So there's actually a lot of peat. Now it's not always the most economic regions that have the peat, let's say. So right now it's easiest. But the biggest challenge right now has been that communication. So communication about what actually is science facts and what is emotional facts. So and communicating what has to be done when a peatland is depleted, having the right regulation in place to make sure that there are security deposits there and mandatory restoration plans, and only allowing basically new peatlands to be opened if there's a track record showing that your company has been responsible with what they've done. Now, and I'm sorry to blab so much, but I'm very passionate about this, and I'm happy to have some time. So 83% of the industry in Canada is certified sustainable. And the reason why we've all done this is we've seen what's happened in Europe, and we've kind of decided as an industry, let's get together. And I do believe there's lots of responsible peat moss producers in Europe, and I believe these two gentlemen are. What I would recommend and really kind of push to is for them to band together as an association, do more restoration work, more research, more communication, and band together and do this, because having an individual approach is just not working. I think that you ask any mushroom grower here, they'll ask you that peat moss is the best. Now, are they not looking at anything else? Yes, they are, and I believe that that's a great thing to do. At the end of the day, I think it will show that peat moss is still the best material, but if you're using wood fiber, or using whatever else it is to improve the quality of your growing media, or lowering the costs, I think that's the real benefit to people here.
Okay, thank you. Now, Ray, recently there were some issues in the States in relation to supplies of brown peat for your industry, and I think with your friend Mr. DeSantis, you actually started to use
the peat moss man, not the governor.
Wood fiber in the mix. Right. What was your experience with using wood fiber?
What happened in the United States, well, Canada, in 2022, I believe, Scott's Peat determined that they would rather sell their peat moss to the nursery industry than the mushroom industry. And on short notice, they cut the mushroom industry off. No more. And we went into panic mode. There was no peat available. We were bringing it down from Manitoba to bring it to the East Coast, doing whatever we could to import peat. We were bringing it from Ireland, from Lithuania, Latvia, everywhere. Plus, it gave us an opportunity, or forced us into a situation where we had to search for alternatives. And I think that was the very interesting thing of the whole exercise. There were a few products, one of them hydrofiber, which is a bark wood byproduct of the lumber mills down in the Carolinas. And that was brought up in big bales. And prior to the issue, it was too expensive to use. And when we got boycotted there by Scott's Peat, suddenly it became very interesting. On the other end, we became a vertically integrated industry in the sense that we started using spent mushroom compost again. And it was not only the compost, but the casing soil. And in the States, we just dump everything. We don't separate it all. So there was a massive inventory of spent mushroom compost. It had been weathered, it had been processed, and some of the salts had been taken out of. And some of the industrious people from Kennett Square started processing the material, and it became a regular part of the casing soil mix at that time. As it turned out, more or less 50% of the casing soil was alternative products, was this hydrofiber as well as the spent mushroom compost. And it worked good. You know, we didn't have the data like you presented there, but anecdotally, we didn't see a lot of problems. There were cultural things we had to do. The hydrofiber had more structure. It released more water quickly. We had to change our watering practices. But ironically, the use of hydrofiber and spent mushroom compost sort of neutralized each other. So yeah, it was an interesting exercise. To this day, many people are still using those products, but much less than happened at that time. I think everyone is very happy to get back to the peat moss, and I would agree with you. You know, I'm an environmentalist, probably more than most, but I really don't see the emotional problem that there is with harvesting peat. You know, it's there. It's not a problem. It's not creating pollution. It's not adding to the carbon problem. Sometimes I think this peat moss thing is a bit of a emotional issue that some people tend to take advantage of.
Environmental sentiment.
It is, and I think it's a very good point. And I just want to say this, that, you know, last week I've been visiting nurseries and mushroom farms, and they talk about, well, we're getting pressure from the grocery chains, or we're getting pressure from this store, right? Like, how are you going to plan on reducing peat, or how are you going to go peat free? And I guess my question is, well, have you informed your salesperson? Have you talked to your supplier? You know, because if you are getting that kind of pressure, well, you should be basically showing them facts about what your company is doing or what your industry is doing. So I really encourage you, if Kohl's or Woolworths or somebody is asking you what's your plan on reducing peat, why? Well, environmental reasons. Well, let's talk about the facts. And if you don't have the facts, which is fair, whoever you're buying peat from should have them.
Okay, that's a good point. That actually leads or segues nicely into this question. The Monaghan mushrooms in Ireland have recently announced that they are now supplying white mushrooms into Sainsbury's in the UK, grown totally in a non-peat casing mix. Is this the thin end of the wedge?
We saw that we saw that article too, and I have also many questions about that, and we know that they're working on that. But they mentioned also the yield, what they have. Are they the same as with peat casing? Because that casing could be more sustainable, but when you grow less yield, you need more square meters for example, 100 ton of mushrooms. And what kind of effect has that on the sustainability then? The peat casing itself is maybe more sustainable. And that's also what we have also 2 brands in Holland now with alternative casing. One is 30% replaced to a green compost, the other 10% the sphagnum moss. Both works very well with the same growing usage and the same yield. But when we go over 50%, then you see the reduction of yield.
Roland?
Yeah, I just want to add it. You cannot ignore the pressure from the environment and the supermarket, so we have a responsibility to try to find solutions. And as also Samp said, we are also doing casing soils with spent compost and with wood fiber. We put in the market. In the Netherlands, Albert Heijn is actually forcing their growers to use peat reduced. They're not making advertisement about it, but that is what they demand. So that we want peat reduction. So that we have to fulfill. And then you come to what are you going to do then? Okay, spent compost, if it's clean, you can use it. Only EC level is too high. Wood fiber, when it's the right wood fiber and it's clean enough, you can use it, but not in the percentages like 100%. That will cost yield.
Yeah.
And to our Dutch compatriots, are you doing any research into alternatives, either BBB or Legro?
We have a green growth program in the Kekkila-BVB. Our target is to replace 50% of the total volume, substrate volume, with alternatives, including the casing. But it could be retail, could be 100%, and casing maybe that 30%. What we see with some materials, when you go over the 30%, then your specs are heavy metals and that kind of things are going over the level, and that's why some alternatives are limited in the blend. And what are you replace in the blend? Not the heavy duck peat, the blunt peats.
Okay, we've got a reasonable amount of time left. I'd like to throw it open to questions from the floor. There's got to be some burning questions about this difficult topic.
Let's hear it.
I would like to take the opportunity to ask some questions. The discussion now has been on sustainability and the peat reduction, and the gentleman from Holland, they indicated that the demand for peat will go up worldwide 3-4 times in the coming 30 years. That will have an effect on the price of the available peat. How does the gentlemen from USA and Europe think the price development will be for the raw material? And then the question for the audience here is, how long can you afford it?
Okay, who'd like to take that one?
I'd just like to say one comment. There's going to be more demand for peat worldwide, but there's going to be more demand for everything worldwide. So it's going to be more wood fiber, more cocoa, more everything, compost. So it's not just peat, it's going to be everything. And of course, if there's more demand, it's going to be higher price necessitated.
That's an interesting comment because, it's false economies, I guess. Well, you save something here, but if you save that, as you were saying, you have to put down more square meters, or you have to have more farms, or you have to charge more money, or you have to bring product from farther distances, which adds to the carbon footprint, which this whole thing just snowballs into a bigger thing over a very non-problem, we could call it.
So what is your solution to that, Ray? What would you advocate we should do as an industry?
Sorry.
What should we do as an industry in order to...
Education.
So one thing, like I said, I talk too much, and please cut me off. But so one difference is I remember last year in Ottawa. So we have Hill Days. So our industry actually goes to Ottawa, meets politicians, meets bureaucrats, and actually educates them on our industry. And 2 years ago, we met with the leader of the Green Party in Canada, and we had a first meeting with her. We gave all the facts. We gave all the information. Okay, well, I'll take it back. Thank you very much. Nice to meet you. 1 year later, we met her again. And she said, I've checked you guys out. I've checked you with my people, and we're very happy. You guys do a great job. Well done. And we took photos with that person, and it's like, in other countries, there would be no way a peat company could take a picture with a Green Party leader shaking hands. So I think education and also really, yeah.
And what's your take on that, Eoghan? Because obviously in Ireland, which is, a peat bog,
Yep.
you're now precluded.
The peat bog.
You're now. Sorry. You're now precluded from any new extraction, and I mean it's probably limited to people who want to burn turf for warming their homes.
So I'll come at the point from a few different perspectives. I suppose in Europe generally, Canada, I suppose, is lucky in that it's only extracted, like you said, 0.03% of its bogland. In Europe, 80% of the bogs that exist have been degraded. So it's therefore harder for the politicians to be shaking hands with peat producers, I would say. Just for the fact of the long history of peat extraction, usually for energy production. So in Ireland, of all of the peat extracted, most of that peat, about 9 million cubic meters, went into energy production, and only about 0.31% of that went into professional horticulture, and about 0.34% of that went into retail horticulture. So I suppose that's the difficulty, is most of the peat extracted in Ireland was for energy production and not necessarily for horticultural production.
And Jackie, can I ask you the question? I mean, obviously in New Zealand, the government came up with the fart tax in relation to animals. Has there been a similar pressure in terms of the extractive industries?
Probably nothing massive. Every now and then there's an article in the paper. One of the situations we've got in Southland is, I think in the last 150 years, 400,000 hectares of wetland has been drained, and 400 hectares of that was for horticultural purposes. The rest is for pasture. So while you're worried about your peat-free mushrooms, are you also worried about your peat-free milk, your peat-free cheese, your peat-free meat? So I think a lot of that pressure is sort of diverted to the bigger industries with the bigger problems.
Thank you. Any more questions from the floor? Craig. At the back.
I have a question for the gentlemen who have some experience with the wood fibre in respect to what types of timber have you tried? Because obviously there's very varying types with different levels of carbohydrate and polymers and makeup, and what potential pre-treatment they need to be incorporated as a casing.
Okay. Well, so in my wider work in horticulture, we've tested, I think, 18 different wood fibre types, and no wood fibre is the same. So it depends on the species, as you say. It depends on what the bark content of a wood fibre is. So generally speaking, most of the wood fibre is the heartwood, and some component of that can be bark. But it also depends then on the processing treatment. So you can have hammer milled wood fibres, which some mightn't consider true wood fibre. You can have disc refined wood fibres, which are much finer. So I think it comes down to how you characterize wood fibres in the first place. But like you said, most of the wood fibres we have experience with are pine species or softwoods, but it depends again on how that's processed. So for casing, I would say what's most valuable is having the wood fibres as fine as you can get it.
So there are a couple of wood fibre people in the audience Would they care to comment? Ted, maybe Lou?
Kom maar zitten. Kom maar zitten, Joeske.
For the mushroom, there are a few aspects that are really important for the wood fiber. Obviously, fungi and contamination of other fungi are a problem. So the wood fiber is basically sterile in most of the cases, in most of the systems, how to make the wood fibers of different types. And if you don't protect them, you can have different diseases coming to your farm, which is really a big threat in my eyes. What Eoghan said, in peat you have two ways of harvesting peat moss. So you have block peat, which is normally very stable. You have mill peat, which is the majority of what we do, and we have dock peat, which we use for the casing. Basically, with the wood fiber, you see the same thing. The different species of wood are more or less the different species of peat moss that we have as well. So we have Irish peat, which is significantly different than the American peat. And the way you extract your wood fiber is more or less the same what you do with peat, the way you extract it and excavate it. So if you have a refiner and you have a heat system, you make it more or less inert. You don't have any problems. Also in the horticultural side of things, you don't see nitrogen drawdown. You make it an inert product. The less finer you make the wood fiber, so singleize out the individual fibers, the more problems you will have over time. It will collapse, it will change the structure, and that will have effect on what you do. Water holding capacity is based on the surface space, so the finer the fibers, the more surface space, the more water holding capacity. So that's what importance for casing.
Thank you.
By the way, it's Canadian peat, not American peat.
I'm Dutch, almost the same.
Don't say that to a Kiwi in Australia.
Now, maybe one thing to add about wood fibers, because we use a lot of wood fibers as well.
Any more questions?
yes.
David?
You missed it.
Sorry?
Sorry, Chair. I was just talking a little bit about wood fiber again.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, you missed it. As we say, the finer, the better you can hygienize it, so that's awfully good. The bad thing about wood fiber actually is that you need a lot of it, because the shrinkage is enormous. So it's sustainable. That's correct. So we are using it, but we must not. It's the cost-wise. It's a lot of cost, and especially in our local market, that's a problem. Of course, here in Australia, it's a different ball game because they have much more logistic cost. So, but in our local market, the uses of wood fiber adds cost.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Lou?
Okay, I'm from Australian wood fibre, so we'll be making it, or we are making the wood fibre here, not yet for casing material. But yeah, I agree with friends from Profile. There's very many different ways of making wood fibre, and extruded is mostly used in horticulture. But it actually fibrillizes only a third of the wood. So 2/3 are still chip if you use that type of wood fibre. So it's not truly wood fibre. It's chip and some wood fibre. So it's important to use the right process also with heating, like it was said. But I think the closer you can make it to the source, or where you would want to use it, the better. And we're looking forward to developing some products here in Australia, or wood fibre, that you might be able to use. And I think it's going to need some tuning. It's not going to be the same as the stuff we use in horticulture. It's going to be different. And we need to adapt it to that. And it might still need some peat to be added and other products to be added, but I'm sure we can find a local solution based on wood fibre.
Thank you. Any more comments? Eric Benoit.
Just to come back on the retail and what the retailer says to the producers about reducing peat, etc., etc. But it was already mentioned before, education. And I think we have an industry which can upscale very quickly. When there comes a need for food in the world, then I think the mushroom industry can upscale extremely quickly. Secondly, it's a contradictory, how do you say it? Contradiction? Discussion from the retail, because the retail insists more and more on putting pressure on the producers, reducing peat, etc., which leads to an increase of cost. On the other hand, also for the retail, all fresh produce is the best money maker they have in their shelves. So I think education is here. I think a main a need to, as an industry worldwide, to start communicating and also researching what our industry can do by to improve the circular economy, just by giving them a little bit of peat, which is only maybe responsible for a 0.0 point CO2 part of the footprint. So I think education and bring the beauty of our industry more under the attention of the retailer, which brings them a good return in terms of profitability in their shelves. And our industry, I think, is one of the agriculture industry which can upscale extremely fast to fulfill in the future food for a growing population. So I think education altogether, I think, is probably more important than finding all these alternatives with respect, but I think it's only a small thing. And we do maybe, as an industry, maybe we reduce in the CO2 footprint more by making the economy more circular or make more awareness to the retailer about this fact, but we have to tell the story to these guys.
So you advocate that we should be advocating to government that we need the peat? Yeah.
Of course, it's only a small thing,
yeah.
But maybe on the other side we can contribute way more to reduce the CO2 footprint by recycling maybe more. You know, what do? We produce spent compost that goes on the field, we grow wheat, take the straw, produce a high value, healthy product. We can upscale extremely fast, so we only need a little bit of peat. So I think that awareness bringing to the retail or governments or whatever we need. But if there is a shortage, then the government will change like that and say, guys, produce mushrooms as fast as you can. So I think this whole thing, it's about putting more pressure on the suppliers, but at the end of the day, I'm confident that we are still working in a beautiful industry, and better to be a mushroom farmer than a cow of a cattle farm.
Exactly. So we've got time for one final one. Is that?
Sorry.
Helen.
So I think some of the things we have to keep in mind is that if there is going to be an increased demand for food, and if mushrooms are going to be one of those foods, then there'll also be an increased demand for casing. So that will again increase our use of peat. So we still have to address that. And another point I'd like to make is that the whole peat question is being driven by climate change. Peat bogs and peatlands are big carbon reserves. They store far more carbon than the percentage of the land that they cover. So 3% of the land, but 30% of the carbon. And I think this is why Europe is driving reduction of peat use and peat extraction, so that we reduce our carbon footprint. And we know that the carbon emissions are driving climate change. Climate change is also having an impact. It impacted on peat harvesting in Canada, for example. So it is quite a complex situation we're in, and I think we do have to strive for more sustainability, using more of these naturally more sustainable products rather than continuing to use. Even though it's a small amount, I agree, we still have to, I think, strive for more sustainability within our industry if we can.
So just to respond about CO2 and carbon emissions sequestration. So CSPMA funded research from McGill University, Dr. Nigel Roulet, and he spent a lot of years with a lot of students measuring emissions on all parts of the bog, all parts of the production. And there is definitely a spike when the peat bog is open for production, no doubt. But what they found was, because they followed through what happens when the bog is restored. It doesn't end when the peat bog is open and we're harvesting peat. It continues going. So what happens is there is a spike of emissions when the peat bog is being harvested. When we restore that peatland to a natural state, which Canada's done a great job doing. The oldest bog in what is 100, 200 acres, I think, was restored 20 years ago, and you go there, you can't tell a difference. So when you measure that emission, it's very low. So now it's becoming a carbon sink again. So it spikes and then it starts becoming carbon sink. So all I want to say is that yes, there is a lot of emissions, but it becomes a carbon sink once a responsible producer restores it.
I think that's when you actually do that restoration. And I think peat extraction in Canada is also quite, different to, say, peat extraction in Europe or from the raised bogs, the deep raised bogs, where when you do drain those big peat reserves, you are actually encouraging carbon emissions continually over the life of that bog if it's drained. So it's only when you restore the peatland that you'll get that carbon sequestration again. So I think we just have to take it responsibly, try and have responsibly sourced peat, have those restoration projects in line for when we're using peat, but also to focus on being more sustainable as well and using some of the other ingredients that we have that we will be able to access on a more continuous basis. Also, there's the biodiversity aspect of peatlands that, you know, peat extraction is having big impacts on biodiversity loss. So,
I would respectfully, please, have you visited the restored sites in Canada?
No.
You have to. Please do. Because what I want to...
I'm talking more from Europe, where half the peat casing, let's say, is coming from Europe and European peatlands, and that's what's driving us towards more sustainable materials for our casing.
I think historically what's important to note is, in the case of Ireland at least, a lot of the extraction was done prior to any planning or licensing legislation, and there was no requirement then to restore the peatlands. So a lot of the peat bogs in Europe have no future plans for restoration. They might have land use change, which still emits carbon if it's turned to forestry or it's turned to other agricultural uses. And that's the important point, is Canada's nearly leading the way in terms of extracting and then having legislation in place to require restoration of the peat bogs. That's not necessarily the case in Europe, at least historically.
Maybe I think we both are using 100% responsible produced peat.
Yeah.
So at the moment everything is restored and we wet it. So it's not only in Canada. I think every peat bog we are using, we make sure that we are leaving it behind. And
I was speaking more just historically.
Okay.
Yeah, there is responsibly sourced peat now in Europe.
What we do with restored peat fields in Finland is plant red canary grass on it, absorb CO2 again, and red canary grass is used for in the future for substrates and maybe also for casing soil. So we have already 1,600 hectares restored with red canary plant with red canary grass, and that's also something what we have to communicate, that is also the substrate of the future. Maybe also for casing, but at the moment we are doing research on that.
Okay, thanks. Well, we're just about out of time, but one desperate question. What?
Yeah, there.
Just a real quick okay. Just a very quick comment. It's, if we just put aside the environmental issues for one moment, there are other drivers to reduce use of peat, and that is price and availability.
Yeah.
And COVID totally exposed how vulnerable we in Australia and even in the US were to just not having peat available at any price.
Jenny, but you don't take into consideration using alternatives and then your yield going down by 10% or more. That is the biggest cost to a farmer. And it's very easy for academics to say you need to reduce. But the one thing that we see as a farming community, the academics don't understand that, okay, there is alternatives, but then when it reduces their production by 10%, what that does to the profitability of the farm is horrendous.
But I think it's fair to say, David, that whilst we can obtain deep dug casing soil from the Netherlands or Germany or wherever, that growers will use that, and it's only in extremist when we can no longer source that material for whatever reason, be it geopolitical or environmental, that we'll be forced down that track. So, yeah. Can we have one last comment from this gentleman here, please?
Thank you. Just one final comment for an industry, and it may be particular relevance for Australia and New Zealand. Monaghan mushrooms have been growing somewhere in the region of 6 rooms a week of peat-free substrate, and they've been doing it for about 3 years on a commercial level, learning how to do it. And what they're going to do is they're going to charge their supermarket a lot more for it, because it's what the consumer wants. And the consumer's always right, even when they're not right, because the supermarkets are only doing what they think their consumers want. So there's a whole cycle that, unless we're Coca-Cola, we're not going to solve, or we're not going to change customers' perception. But what we can do is charge them for the privilege and say, if you want peat-free, the cost is higher. Because Monaghan say that they are doing fully commercial yields. And they're not in the business to lose money. Europe is a very competitive market. So I think there's actually an opportunity. There's a silver lining to the big cloud where we can reduce peat, but we can also be peat-free eventually with all the stakeholders and charge more. That's just my comment for a positive to the end.
But that is also a problem in the Netherlands. They want the supermarket want to have the same price for a high product.
Yeah, but that's the marketing, that's the industry, especially here in Australia and New Zealand, where you have 2 items with all those companies. You have an opportunity to lead the way.
We saw that in the Netherlands. Thank you. Bank mushrooms, for example, Jurgen Bank is also mentioned in the few speakers before. They are using all the farms alternative peat with 30% reduced peat, and in the beginning they thought, oh, I have an opportunity with my colleagues, but they lost market instead from win market because of the price, and that's it is an opportunity, but in practice, in some areas, don't work.
It's obviously a very convoluted and difficult problem that we need to solve. But I'll just hand over, maybe Ray, you want a closing remark?
Yeah, maybe I could close with one thing. We in the mushroom industry, as well as every other industry out there, is being pressured on sustainability. All the stores are coming to you and asking you, what are you doing to increase your sustainability? And this enters into that sphere of importance. And the only thing that I would contribute in that regard for us as mushroom growers, with respect to casing soil, is we try to find alternative materials within a short radius. That perhaps you use spent compost, as we have in the United States. 20% of our casing soils is spent compost without a problem. When it becomes a cultural problem, it's a big problem, because that hurts our sustainability as a business. But if we can promote ourselves as a more sustainable business venture by using some local raw materials and extending the casing soil 25%, 30%, whatever. It makes better business sense if you could do it economically. It makes better sense sustainability-wise. About 10 years ago, I wrote an article for the mushroom business, Friends of the Environment. And I don't know if anybody, well, probably 20 years ago, and most of you weren't even born, but it was, I think, it was a pretty decent article. And several of my clients use that as when they talk to HEB or the multiples about their practices of sustainability and what are they doing to improve that. Here's this article. And it satisfies them.
Thanks, Ray. Anyway, I think that was a very riveting and interesting panel discussion. I'd like to thank Owen, Jackie, Ronald, and Ray and Jody. So give the guys a big hand of applause, please.